This is the story of Mrs. Muffly's monster. Mrs. Muffly lives in a house on top of a hill. She's always been a bit strange, but lately she's been acting very, very strangely indeed. We think that's because she's keeping a huge monster in her house. This must be true because on Monday, Mrs. Muffly went out and bought a great big pile of sugar. We think that's because she needs lots of sugar to sweeten up the monster and make him much less scary. On Tuesday, Mrs. Muffly went out and bought 27 dozen eggs. We think that's because the monster needs lots of eggs to style his hair in the morning. On Wednesday, Mrs. Muffly went out and bought 58 packets of butter. We think that's because the monster has the roughest feet in the world and he needs the butter to soften them up. On Thursday, Mrs. Muffly went out and bought 41 sacks of flour. We think the monster uses them to sleep on at night. He's a fussy monster. On Friday, Mrs. Muffly went out and bought 464 jars of jam. We think that's because the monster likes to take really deep jam baths. On Saturday, Mrs. Muffly didn't come out at all. And from her house on the hill, we saw great big clouds of smoke and flames and strange shapes at the windows. We think the monster must have escaped and eaten poor Mrs. Muffly. On Saturday, it was the giant cake competition. And there, in the middle of all the cakes, with not the slightest sign of being eaten, was Mrs. Muffly, with first prize for the biggest monster-sized cake ever. We think she must have had some help. The end.